Daniel had lived a relatively unremarkable life until he inherited a creaky century-old house from a distant uncle he barely remembered. On the day he arrived, the sky was overcast and a biting wind rustled through the barren trees that lined the driveway. Tired from the drive, Daniel got out of the car and stared at the silhouette of an old house looming on the horizon. Its deformed garden and broken shutters seemed to stare at him with unblinking eyes. Stepping inside, Daniel was greeted by an unsettling silence. There was no echo of his footsteps, no rumble of distant traffic, just a heavy press of silence. As he wandered through the dusty rooms, it seemed to him that the house felt too empty, as if it had long been depleted of human warmth. Although he convinced himself that it was just his nerves, he swore he heard faint sounds somewhere outside the walls. A soft scraping, a distant whisper, barely audible, but impossible to ignore. That first night, lying in bed, he realized that there was something else in the house with him. The floorboards in the hallway groaned as if a weight had fallen on them. Then he heard the unmistakable clang of metal sliding across the wooden floor, and then there was such silence that Daniel's heartbeat was pounding in his ears. When he woke up in the morning, he saw thin scratches on the living room wall that he hadn't noticed the night before. Perhaps it was an animal, he thought, pawing at the peeling wallpaper. But the length and location of the marks seemed purposeful, deliberate. They contained no words, but the sight of them sent a cold, primal fear through Daniel's veins. It was as if someone or something was trying to communicate, just out of reach. Despite the sense of impending danger, Daniel couldn't ignore the fascination that gripped him. What secrets did these walls hide? Or, more disturbingly, what hidden observer seemed determined to make his presence felt? He had just begun to realize how little he really knew about this house and how dangerous his curiosity could become. And yet, despite the dark cloud of anxiety that was looming over him, Daniel decided that there was no turning back. The house belonged to him now, and the secrets buried in it needed to be uncovered. The following day, driven by lingering unease and a growing sense of morbid curiosity, Daniel decided to scour every inch of the property for clues. He started in the basement, which exuded a pungent smell of mold and rotting wood. The single, dim light bulb flickered overhead, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Each time the light faltered, Daniel felt his pulse race, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the momentary darkness. As he ran his fingertips across the damp concrete, he discovered a faint outline along the wall, a narrow, vertical seam he hadn't noticed before. Curiosity burning within him, Daniel pressed against it. With a groan of protest, the section of wall gave way, revealing a narrow, shadowy corridor. Cobwebs and stale air erupted from the dark passage, and the sudden, musty wind nearly knocked him back. Inside, the corridor's walls were lined with old photographs in broken frames. The images were half-faded, but in several, Daniel thought he glimpsed the same twisted figure standing among faceless crowds. It looked vaguely human, until he saw the two long limbs, the hollowed eyes. His stomach knotted as he realized that the figure appeared in every photo, always lurking at the edges, as though haunting the scene. Halfway down the passage, Daniel felt a trickle of cold sweat slide down his temple. The corridor grew narrower, forcing him to turn his shoulders sideways. The only sound was his own breath rasping in the stale air. Abruptly, a soft scraping noise came from behind him. He spun around, heart thundering in his chest. But the corridor was empty. No movement, no silhouette to blame. Just the echo of that bone-chilling scrape, as if something was following, studying his every move. Gripping the flashlight tighter, Daniel pressed on, each step more hesitant than the last. Something lay at the end of this hidden hallway, waiting for him. And in the pit of his gut, he knew that once he set eyes on whatever he found, his life would never be the same. Shaken by the hidden corridor and the eerie photographs, Daniel forced himself to keep moving forward. The narrow passage seemed to stretch on far longer than the dimensions of the house should allow. His flashlight beam wavered along rough stone walls, revealing more unsettling relics. A child's dusty shoe, a single leather glove with the fingers worn through, and the rusted shell of an antique lantern. Each abandoned object told its own cryptic story. Daniel's mind churned with questions. Had his uncle known about this corridor? Had he walked these shadows, too? Or had something else drawn him down here? The deeper Daniel ventured, the more unnerving his surroundings became. Vague outlines of graffiti sprawled across the walls, messages left in sloppy, hastily scrawled handwriting. Though the words had faded with age, a few phrases remained legible. Listen, she calls for you, and don't let it see you. The letters themselves seemed to writhe in the weak flashlight beam, as though still alive with desperation. Daniel's skin prickled at every new discovery. He found himself breathing through his mouth to avoid gagging from the pungent scent of damp rot, aware that every step brought him closer to something indescribable. Eventually, the corridor opened into a cramped chamber that felt colder than anywhere else in the basement. The room's ceiling was low, forcing Daniel to stoop, and its single overhead light bulb flickered ominously. At the center stood a battered wooden table. Papers, yellowed and curled at the edges, were scattered across its surface. Daniel noticed old newspaper clippings, half-crumpled photographs, and pages torn from what looked like a leather-bound journal. His trembling fingers picked up one photograph. It showed a smiling family, a father, a mother, two small children, posing in front of a pristine version of the very house he stood in. Each pair of eyes stared into the camera with an unsettling intensity, as though they were aware of a secret lurking just out of frame. Careful not to disturb the brittle pages too much, Daniel leafed through the torn journal entries. In shaky handwriting, they described inexplicable noises, visions of shadows dancing across the walls, and accounts of half-seen figures roaming the corridors. One passage in particular made his blood run cold. Tonight, I locked the door, but the scratching never stopped. It's inside the walls. Or the walls are part of it. I fear I've awakened something with my curiosity. The entry ended abruptly in a spatter of what looked terribly like dried blood. Outside the small chamber, a sudden creaking noise echoed in the corridor, like floorboards under immense weight. Daniel froze, torn between the need to investigate and the primal urge to hide. Slowly, he poked his head around the corner, shining his flashlight into the darkness. A chill snaked down his spine. The corridor he'd come from was now shrouded in a gloom that seemed to breathe, rippling with impossible shadows. For a heartbeat, Daniel thought he saw movement, a pale shape gliding along the wall. But it vanished with the flicker of the flashlight, leaving only the oppressive silence. He returned to the table, heart pounding, and carefully gathered the journal pages. If his uncle, or whoever penned these entries, had discovered something horrifying about the house, Daniel needed to understand it, no matter how terrifying the truth. Still, the fear in the back of his mind insisted he might be meddling with forces beyond his comprehension. That next creak reverberated through the corridor again, closer this time, like the footfall of something far too large and far too ancient. Daniel clutched the papers to his chest, his pulse hammering in his ears, as he realized that whatever lurked here in the bowels of his inherited home might already know he was there, and it was waiting. Clutching the pages of the diary to his chest, Daniel backed away from the entrance to the small room, feeling fear twisting in his stomach like a living thing. The flashlight flickered, and for one terrifying moment he was left in absolute darkness. He felt the air change, become heavier, as if an invisible presence was pressing down on him. A quick shake of the flashlight brought the beam back to life, but in that brief darkness he could have sworn he heard a muffled whisper, incredibly close, whispering his name. Determined not to let panic consume him, Daniel resumed his steps down the narrow corridor, flinching as his boots crunched against the debris on the floor. Every sound he made seemed to be amplified in the suffocating silence. He kept glancing over his shoulder, convinced that if he looked away for too long, the corridor might change its shape or move closer to him. The feeling that he was being watched intensified tenfold, as if the house knew about his intrusion into these secret depths. When he reached the hidden doorway that led back to the basement, he stopped, noticing something on the wall. What had once been a neat seam now looked wider, as if the opening had widened. Even more disconcerting were the subtle footprints that stretched across the dusty floor, and disappeared into the corridor he had just left. They looked fresh, too fresh, and led away from him, not towards him, as if someone else had left that passage a few minutes ago. With his heart pounding, Daniel hurried through the opening into the relative openness of the basement. Daylight fell on the rickety staircase leading upstairs, a comforting reminder of the world outside. But as he approached the stairs, he noticed something new. A smear of dark residue on the bottom riser, glistening in the dim light. Trembling, he touched it with his fingertip and recoiled. It was wet. Thousands of possibilities flooded his mind. It could be water, but it could also be blood. His pulse pounded in his ears as he realized that it certainly hadn't been before he explored the hidden corridor. Climbing the stairs, Daniel stepped out into the corridor from the kitchen, almost tripping over the edge of the worn carpet. He closed the basement door behind him, turning the bolt with trembling hands. Only when the door was closed did he notice how quickly the sun had disappeared behind the clouds, its fading rays slanting through the windows, flooding the living room with an orange glow that made every shadow more sharp. Outside, the wind picked up, scraping tree branches against the siding with the sound of nails on board. He entered the living room and carefully placed the pages of the diary on the coffee table. Trying to calm his breathing, he stared at those mysterious photographs and clippings again and again. The constant presence of this bony, elongated figure in each picture was getting on his nerves. Why did it appear again and again? Always on the periphery, staring, but never looking at anyone directly. Another wave of fear threatened to overwhelm him when he thought that this figure might be connected to something moving through the secret corridors of this house. Daniel's gaze darted to the front window as he heard the sound of a car driving down the lonely road outside. The rational part of his soul screamed for him to leave, leaving this place for whatever nightmares it held. But a stronger urge, a dark curiosity, kept him tied to this place. From the pages of the journal, it was clear that the previous occupants had felt something deeply evil in the bones of this house. Now he was determined to find out what that evil was, no matter what it took. Suddenly, there was a piercing thud from above, causing Daniel to jump. It sounded like something large had hit the floorboards right above his head. Before he could steel himself, the same impact was repeated, this time closer, as if moving along the ceiling towards the stairs to the corridor. Cold sweat drenched his shirt. Was there a second corridor? Or an attic? Perhaps there was something crawling in the tight darkness between the ceiling and the roof. Daniel cautiously climbed the main staircase, his hand slipping along the crooked banister. Each step creaked, threatening to collapse beneath him. After a few steps, he noticed that the door at the end of the corridor was ajar, a door he was sure he had locked earlier in the day. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed tangible, so thick that it seemed to seep into the corridor. Daniel summoned up his courage and continued on his way. But just before he reached the top landing, every light in the house flickered and died, plunging him into an otherworldly darkness. The sudden hush seemed to swallow his breath. Adrenaline coursed through him, and he fumbled with his phone, hoping the screen would at least provide some glow. Then the phone's screen flashed to life, revealing something on the far end of the hallway. Something that shifted, elongated, and vanished the moment his eyes landed on it. In its place remained only the open door, beckoning him with silent malice. Daniel's chest tightened. Had he truly seen a figure? Or was his mind conjuring horrors from the gloom? With shallow, rapid breaths, he stepped onto the landing and felt an unnatural chill radiating from the open doorway. At that moment, the house felt more alive than ever, like it was breathing him in, waiting for the perfect moment to exhale a nightmare. He realized, with dawning horror, that there was no simple way out of this. The secrets rooted in these walls demanded an audience, and he was their unwilling guest. As darkness swallowed the corridor, Daniel clenched the banister with bone-white knuckles. His phone's glow was weak, but it was the only light source he had left. In that small pool of illumination, the dusty floor revealed footprints that weren't his own, smudged, elongated tracks that seemed to drag across the hallway. A low current of chilly air swept past him, carrying with it a faint stench of decay. It teased at the edges of his mind, hinting that something vile and nameless had passed this way. Steeling himself, He approached the half-open door. It led into one of the guest bedrooms he hadn't explored in depth, an old-fashioned chamber with tattered velvet drapes and an ornate dresser. By the phone's glow, Daniel spotted furniture draped in sheets, ghostly silhouettes scattered around the perimeter of the room. The air felt thick and suffocating, like an invisible weight pressing down on his lungs. He stepped over the threshold, and that was when he noticed an unsettling detail. The sheets covering the furniture were tied in place with twine at the bottom, as though deliberately restraining whatever lay beneath. A slow shiver ran down Daniel's spine. He couldn't help but imagine that the furniture itself, or something using the furniture as a shell, had been bound, trapped in a silent standstill. Drawing closer, he gently brushed a trembling hand along one of the sheets, feeling the coarse texture beneath his fingertips. The sheet bulged in strange ways, as if whatever lay under it was not just a chair or table, but something with lumps and protrusions. Heart thudding, he crouched and found the twine's knot. The moment his fingertip touched the knotted string, however, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, sending a shudder through the entire house. He froze, waiting for the tremor to pass, half expecting the knot to slither away on its own. Once the wind died, Daniel forced himself to untie the twine, ignoring the frantic beat of his own heart. Slowly, he peeled back the sheet, expecting to find some neglected piece of furniture, but what he uncovered was an old rocking chair with scuffed arms and a seat marred by deep claw-like scratches. A tangle of old rope was looped around one armrest, as if someone had once been tied to the chair, or had tried to tie something inside it. A subtle, agonizing sense of recognition rippled through Daniel's mind. He remembered seeing a rope like this in one of the faded photographs downstairs. A snapshot of a man in that same rocking chair, appearing to restrain himself. But who was he, and why had he needed such drastic measures? Before Daniel could investigate further, the floor behind him groaned. He spun around, phone clutched tightly, to see the rest of the sheets shifting, like something had brushed past them. He caught a glimpse of movement in the corner, just outside the glow of his phone screen. Stumbling backward, he barely kept himself from colliding with the dresser. He angled the phone's beam toward the corner, breath caught in his throat, but whatever he'd seen was gone. A hush fell over the room, and in that suffocating silence, Daniel heard something else, a faint scratching, just beyond the walls. It reminded him of the scrawling marks he'd found on the wallpaper downstairs, as though a restless presence was trapped within the very structure of the house. The sound increased in volume, moving across the walls in a methodical pattern, like a slow, deliberate search. A chill raced along his spine as the noise approached the doorway, pausing there momentarily before retreating back into the hallway. Daniel's head throbbed from the tension, but curiosity flared once more. He pressed his ear to the wall, hearing the scratch, scratch, scratch receding down the corridor, descending the stairs, as though drawn away by something else. This was his chance, he realized, to search the rest of the room without immediate interference. He noticed a battered wardrobe in the far corner. Its door was ajar, revealing darkness within. Summoning the last of his courage, Daniel approached. He tugged the door open with painstaking slowness, half expecting something to leap out. Instead, the phone's light revealed a cramped interior, filled with moldering clothes on rusty hangers. An acrid smell billowed out, sharp enough to make his eyes water. As he shifted the garments aside, Daniel's gaze landed on a small, hand-carved wooden box resting at the back of the wardrobe. Symbols had been etched into its surface, arches and spiral motifs reminiscent of those scrawled warnings in the hidden corridor. With trembling hands, he lifted the box and set it atop a low dresser, trying to ignore the sensation that unseen eyes were peering over his shoulder. The lid of the box was held shut by an intricate latch, heavy and rusted. When he pried it open, the creaking hinge emitted a long, tortured groan that set his teeth on edge. Inside lay several items wrapped in brittle paper. A tarnished locket with a black and white photo of a woman, a lock of hair bound with twine, and a faded letter. The letter's ink was smeared, but he could still make out some lines. Asterisk, it lives in the shadows between walls, drawn to those who delve too deep, a hunger that never ends. Asterisk, a final phrase jumped out at him, scribbled in shaky script. Asterisk, block the door. Bury the key, or it will never rest. Asterisk, a sudden thud in the hallway made Daniel's heart seize. The scratching had returned, or perhaps it had never truly left. This time, it came from directly behind the wall near the door, as if trying to bore its way through the wood. The tempo of the scratching quickened, echoing in Daniel's mind like the ticking of some malevolent clock. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His instincts screamed that he was no longer safe, that whatever was hunting him had found his location. Yet, he couldn't tear his gaze away from the box's contents, from the half-legible text warning of a relentless entity. Panic warred with determination inside him. He needed answers to protect himself and escape. But every new clue seemed to twist the house into something more malignant, more alive. Gathering the old letter and the locket, Daniel shoved them into his pocket. The floor beneath him vibrated with a sudden, vicious impact, something slamming again and again, as if tearing at the wood from below. He whirled around to see the other furniture sheets shifting once more. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, forming shapes that threatened to detach from the corners and envelope him entirely. He stepped back, heart pounding as he realized that the presence was all around him now. The thick hush returned, and with it, the oppressive certainty that he was an intruder in a place that had never intended to let him leave. If the scribbled warnings were right, this was only the beginning. Whatever roamed these halls was hungry for fear, or perhaps something far worse. Clutching the wooden box to his chest, Daniel forced himself into the hallway and slammed the bedroom door behind him, fumbling for the lock. He could hear the scratching on the other side almost instantly, accompanied by a faint, rasping breath. He backed away on unsteady legs, the only light still emanating from his phone's dull screen. And as the corridor closed around him once more, he understood with awful clarity that he was descending into a nightmare from which there might be no return. Daniel raced downstairs, the house groaning all around him as if it might collapse under the weight of its own secrets. In the basement, he spotted a loose patch of floorboards that, once pried aside, revealed a small wooden door hidden beneath the foundation. It reeked of damp earth and rot, as though something foul had been locked away for generations. From the box he'd found upstairs, Daniel retrieved the tarnished locket, its clasp resembling a tiny key. Gritting his teeth, he fitted into the door's rusted lock and turned. Instantly, the air filled with an anguished, shrieking howl that made his blood run cold. Summoning every last ounce of courage, he forced the door shut again, trapping the locket inside. The house shook violently, dust and debris raining down in a choking cloud, then fell silent, as if it had finally drawn a long, ragged breath and gone still. Climbing the steps on unsteady legs, Daniel found the front door open to a pale, fog-shrouded dawn. He shut it behind him, leaving the terrible wails and scratching far below. Though the house stood eerily quiet, Daniel knew its horrors only slumbered. With the key buried and the door sealed, he could only hope the darkness he'd encountered would stay contained. Silently, he vowed never to return. Then he slipped into his car and drove away, the old home's windows glaring at his departure like tired, haunted eyes.